Okay, everybody, let's talk about Chapter 7. Okay, and what we're talking about, Chapter 7, is we're talking about institutional structures. Um, we're going to look at, constitutions, differences between democratic and non democratic systems, unitary, federal, and confederacy. We're going to talk about parliament system, presidential system, and other executive, legislative systems. And then we'll talk about political parties. So, what is a constitution? Basically, a constitution, as we know it here in the United States, is kind of a document that details the rights we have as ordinary citizens. It also has a lot of amendments in there that protects us, especially the first 10 amendments, protects us from government. All right? Um, you know, it tells what, government can do, what government can't do. And it establishes formal power between major political structures, especially here in our area of the world, where our Constitution sets up how certain branches of government can interact with each other. It limits the power of the rules and guarantees the rights of the ruled by defining the maximum extent of the state's authority over its citizens and by enumerating the citizens' freedoms and benefits. This is what we come to know here as our Constitution, as it sets forth the power that the federal government has, and it also has things that the government can't do, like abridge free speech or abridge the freedom of assembly. So, drafting directly or indirectly controlled by those with political power in society. Ours was drafted in 1787 and still has a profound influence on us today. And it could always be changeable, but one thing about the U.S. Constitution, in order to change it, you have to have a very specific set of things that have to happen. Constitutional regimes also operate in terms of the rule of law, and it ensures effective restraints on the power holders. The state can attempt to fulfill the provisions of its constitutions, but it's not always compliant. Non-constitutional regimes are, the structural agreement of the constitutions are not generally upheld, and there are a few restraints on those with political power. But persistent non-enforcement of constitutional provisions, especially those that regard the rights of the ruled, or crucial limits on its rulers. And when we talk about democracy and non-democracy, right? Democracy is arguably the most ideological loaded concept in any discussion about politics and government. Democracy could be a very subjective way to look at a governmental system. We like to say that we have a representative democracy here in the United States. But if we look at that at the very, very minimum, how often do our representatives represent our interests? So it's not necessarily that democratic when you think about it. We have things like direct democracy, especially here in California, where we have people participate. And we also have a republic or representative democracy, much like I mentioned a few minutes ago. That's how the United States operates, where citizens elect people who represent them and make policy decisions on their behalf. Then we also have electoral democracy, where it's a system where all citizens vote in order to select political leaders from among alternative contenders. So much like what we have here. We also have a limited mandate, where this is the condition that means the electorate grants the authority to govern for a fixed period of time. So our senators can govern for 6 years. Our House of Representative members can govern for 2. Our president can govern at most 8 years. So, just kind of like you have a certain type in a certain fixed time that could run out. We have liberal democracy, where citizens don't only have that electoral democracy that we just talked about, but also political rights and civil rights regarding participation, freedoms, and, oppositions. Now, when we look at democracies, democracy focuses on accountability, making sure we're able to hold people responsible for certain actions that they take. An electoral system where we have free and fair elections, and in a sense, you have that limited mandate. But, if we talk about this and ask this question, what of delivering desirable policy outputs? Process plus output, conception of genuine democracy, where we deliver the goods as part of the definition. Overall, it can be very difficult to develop a generally accepted definition of democracy, especially here, where we have a representative democracy in the United States might be totally different than the democracy that exists in other countries throughout the world. Here are examples of liberal democracies, all the way down to not free democracies, or non-democracies that aren't free. And even in China, we could have a democratic aspect, but for the most part, it's still a very much a one-party state. Now, when we look at non-democracies, we look at an autocracy where it's a single ruler exercises absolute power and authority without any legal constraints or citizens' mandate. A dictatorship where it's a person that has absolute power and authority. Authoritarian regime where there's no limited mandate, much like North Korea, but distinguishes all in the political actions and decisions are not constrained, while the political rights and freedom of citizens are severely limited. And also information is controlled by the government, whether it be the internet, readings, or whatever. And then we have a totalitarian regime where the political system's decisions and its control penetrate into virtually every aspect of people's lives. So we look at, some not free countries here. You can see Cambodia, Egypt, Myanmar, Russia, Congo, Swaziland, Vietnam, China, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and North Korea. Now let's talk a little bit about states, federations, and confederations. Or we talk about distribution of power. So if we look at a unitary state, that is where you have clear authority and decisive control and no real stalemates between center and periphery. This, kind of looks at, the instances where there's a concentration more on the local and the state government as opposed to the federal government. A federation will be much like the United States is, where you have a clear delineation of federalism, where we have federal government, local government, and state government, and they all do actions that will benefit its citizens. And then we have confederations, much like the European Union. Unitary state, a central government holds all legitimate power. More than 70 countries are Unitarian. There's a clear hierarchical authority, implementation of policy that's consistent, and citizens tend to identify with the country as a whole rather than regional authorities. Federation is where we have central government is strong and the regional governments share power. Each level has primary control of certain functions. Coordination, not necessarily a hierarchy. Usually federations exist because you have a large-sized government, you have strong states, attempt to create unity or accommodate diversity, desire to disperse political power, and the desire to concentrate power and resources. Now, like I said earlier, the European Union, the United Arab Emirates, the United Nations are all examples of confederations where we have an association where governments delegate some power to a supranational central government but retain primary power. So the EU is a perfect example of that. Now, when we look at legislative branches, we have kind of three common patterns where we have a presidential system, which we are very familiar with here, a parliamentary system, which might exist in a place like the UK, and then hybrid forms of government. So in a presidential system, we have the whole James Madison separation of powers, where we have a separate executive branch and legislative branch, and to throw that on top, we have an executive judicial branch. The separation is done on purpose, which ensures a system of checks and balances, has a body that makes rules or laws, which is our legislature, and then we have a branch that implements those rules and laws, which is our executive branch. And as part of that executive branch, the president appoints cabinet members which are part of the executive branch. The U.S. is the prime model, but we can also see there's other countries here that have aspects of a presidential system as well. Now, we have a parliamentary form of government. This is kind of a fusion of an executive branch and a legislative branch together. People elect the legislatures. This is called the parliament, whose majority empowers a cabinet, which then empowers of its members to be the chief executive, typically the prime minister. So what that means is whoever is the majority party in the legislature has the power to choose the prime minister. But one thing about this is that the prime minister is going to be at the mercy of the legislative branch. So typically they can be voted out by what's called a vote of no confidence. We also have cabinet, and legislatures usually have a term of legislative for a legislative mandate. Here in the United States, it's going to be 2 years or 6 years. The cabinet is usually part of the executive branch here in the United States, but they're responsible to the legislature and also kind of must retain their confidence because the cabinet is approved by the Senate. Legislatures can pressure the cabinet to resign. I talked about the no confidence. And the cabinet may also dissolve the legislature, requiring new elections. Talked about the legislature, the prime minister. Prime minister may be removed, which we just talked about. And if we look at here, we could see how the system works as far as this flow chart, where we as citizens here in the presidential system elect the legislature and elect the president separately, and then the president chooses the cabinet, and then that's confirmed by the legislature, specifically the Senate. If we look at the parliamentary form of government here, the people elect the legislature, the cabinet is set up, they select the prime minister. The prime minister has to have the confidence of the legislature. If they're not, it could be dissolved. We also have hybrid systems where we have a prime minister and elected legislature that can both enact and implement policy, but they also have an independent president elected for a fixed term with some executive functions who can act with decisiveness. A good example of this might be Ireland, who has both a prime minister and a president. Now, there's specific names for them. They are in Gaelic, and I cannot pronounce them, so you can go off on your own and look at it. It's not anything we're going to be testing about, just for your knowledge. Like I said, Germany, Austria, Iraq, and Ireland are examples of these. We also have council systems where, this could be a kind of an analogy of cities here in the United States. Local governments where we have a weak mirror council system. Weak mirror system basically means that the mayor doesn't have as much policy abilities as a strong mayor system does, and also there's a city manager usually that is involved kind of operating the day-to-day challenges of government. But as we know, in a council system, we have a mayor and then a city council that represents each different district here in a city. An assembly, much like what we have here in California, where we have an assembly, which is a legislature that makes laws. And the book talks about New England. Now, when we have party systems here in the United States, we're more familiar with a two-party system, right? Where we have Democrats and Republicans. And that's what we're used to. If you want to, maybe bring in a third party, probably the strongest third party that we have here in the United States is the Libertarian Party. But as we know, they really don't make any major wins come out of them from an electoral runoff or an election. Can have a multi-party system where it's more than two parties that can win enough seats to be potential partners in creating a legislative majority and acting legislation. Most likely, one thing to remember in a lot of these legislative systems, you need a simple majority to pass laws. So if one party doesn't have a simple majority in the legislature, they're going to have to compromise and bargain with other parties in their legislature to try to get a consensus. This is just an example of parties here. It's a little bit dated, but you could see that we have a two-house system here in the United States where it's Democrat and Republican, who are the two-party system. We have 435 seats in the House of Representatives. This data is actually outdated, so just look at the division of power as opposed to the actual figures. And we can look at Sweden and Germany and Cuba and their legislatures as well. Mexico, Canada, Singapore, South Africa. And we can see these all have multi-parties. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at Chapter 8. Okay, in Chapter 8, we're going to talk about economy, right? So we're basically going to focus on three types of economic systems here in the world. We're going to talk about market economy, command economy, and mixed economy. Then we're going to talk a little bit about isms and some of the isms. Now, all our economic system is basically based off of something called supply and demand, and that's what determines your prices. So if your supply is low and your demand is high, prices are going to be high. If your demand is low and your supply is high, prices are going to be low. So what we always kind of like to talk about here is the three different types of economies in the world. Market, command, and mixed. We in the United States, we have a mixed economy. And I think, up to a certain point, how you feel ideologically about business being ran here in the United States and regulation being put on those businesses, it's kind of, gets lost in the fact that, while kind of, the conservative thought and the classic liberal thought is to have at least as little amount of government as possible in our economic system. I think it still kind of is really important to have government intervention in small aspects so we're protected both as the consumer and also as the worker. So if we look at this, this is, kind of a good example of an economic system of government where, we as households have land, labor, and capital. We make payments to buy goods. Payments for those goods are then used to remake goods. And in a sense, we also will get payments through income from goods and services. So just kind of a little bit of a formulaic type of view of the economic system. But one thing that you need in an economic system is that land, labor, and capital. Land to have your plant, labor to kind of do the work, and in capital, like machines or money or stuff like that, or even humans. Humans can be considered capital. Each factor of production is owned by an owner, right? So this is, as we can see, if we're talking about a market or a mixed economy, this is going to be an individual. If we're talking about a command economy, this is going to be the government. And we talked about supply and demand. Supply and demand at equilibrium point is going to be where you determine your price. And this is a good point right here. So if you're, like I said, where you supplied your demand meet, that's going to be how much you can charge. The system exchanges goes around and around. More goods are produced, bought, sold, and consumed by all the actors in the economic system. There's economic growth. And in order to maximize your utilities, all people who are not equally capable of maximizing their value preferences also need to be taken into account of. Now, when we talk about the government coming into our economic system, a government could be a consumer by purchasing any good from a firm. It could replace a household in the sense that it could also control certain factors of production. It can replace a firm by producing a good. It can regulate the manner in which households or firms operate by enacting policies, and that's a very big point here in the United States. There's a tax that could be paid by any person, whether it's a business or a person, and we transfer payments or goods to any actor. And this is another conceptual framework. We have imports, where the goods that a country's actor purchases from another country, the state can discourage, or the government can discourage imports by putting in tariffs, which are a tax on goods that are imported. Kind of, that's the whole belief, is to probably make a segment of the framework of business, purchase a good as opposed to a tariff being put on. And you can, in a sense, see that governments might be able to produce a good cheaper, as opposed to maybe bringing it in on a tariff and then having to pay a little bit more due to that tax. And remember, one thing that we kind of understand about regulations is that ultimately the cost of regulation, the cost of tariffs are ultimately put on us, the consumer. Political economy is in trouble. We have high unemployment because if people aren't working, they can't spend money. A major firm is struggling, whether it's the mortgage industry, the financial industry. Regulation is stifling growth. And we mean regulations, remember, laws that are put into place to have a business pay for either a fine or a tax or whatever. And high taxes are also discouraging investments or consumption. Many economic actors who believe behavior are critical to economic health. Private industry, private financial actors, which are corporations, small business, group representative of those organizations. And how do we determine whether or not a country is prosperous or not, right? So we look at prosperity. We look at the GDP here in the United States, which is the total value of all goods produced by all people within a state boundaries, whether or not they are citizens. We also have GNI, or gross national income. This can measure prosperity as well. It includes the production of all citizens of the state, whether they are inside the state's boundaries or not. Sometimes GDP and GNI can have problems with it. They don't measure how prosperity is distributed across the country's economic actors. Only the goods that actually enter the society's monetary sectors are measured, while many others value goods are ignored. Also talk about PPP, or purchase power parity, which corrects monetary indicators to reflect the amount of currency required in that country to buy certain standard goods. What do you get for your dollar? It's your best bang for your buck, I guess would be able to say. GPI, genuine progress indicator, which adds the economic value of those things that enhance our quality of life and increases environmental sustainability, and it subtracts the cost of those economic activities that reduce quality of life. Right here we have the GINI index, or the Gini index. Basically what this does is it measures inequality among economic systems. And it's the difference between the rich and the poor, the gap between the rich and the poor. And if you look at this, the United States is right in the middle. It's kind of like surprising to see that Mexico, our neighbor to the south, has a higher level of inequality than we do, but not by much. We're right around the same. If we look at places like Sweden, Hungary, Denmark, the gap between the rich and the poor are a little bit different and a little bit smaller than what we've seen here. So taking a look at this, you could see the countries that we have almost the same levels of inequality with. So we talked about market, command, and mixed. Just kind of tie everything up. The market economy is total private control. No government intervention. That laissez-faire system of government, the invisible hand theory that Adam Smith talks about. There's no true pure market economy here in the world. The command economy, where you have total state control, where the government controls all factors of production. The state is a firm that produces all major goods in the system, and the state can set the value for all exchanges within its power. They determine the price. So we talk about some of the challenges associated with each system. The market economy, we could have inequality and hardship. We produce for profit, not necessarily need, and then we could have severe economic cycles. Command economy, this is where the government controls all factors of production. It limits incentives for efficiency. It limits incentives for being innovative, inflexible. And this is a little bit of chart that goes into more detail of what each of these characteristics these systems have. The mixed economy is kind of the blending of the two ideal types of economy while minimizing their shortcomings. And prices are determined by supply and demand. Now we talk about isms. There's capitalism, which we know about, communism, socialism, which we talked a little bit about last week, corporatisms, and if you look at here, these are the different countries and the isms that they represent. And let's go to policy making now. We'll go to the final chapter of this week, chapter 9. Public policy power and decisions. So we're going to talk about what public policy is. Easily, public policy defined. The definition of a public policy is a law that affects the public that is made by a elected official or an appointed decision maker. We'll talk about the stages. We'll talk about the approach, the class approach, the elite approach, and the group approach. So we look at kind of the system of public policy. One reason to kind of study public policy is there is actually a lot of money in that sector if you ever want to decide to get into it, whether it's lobbying or working for a public official that is analyzing effects of a certain policy on a certain situation. We look at here how countries feel about specific policies. We have distributive policies which allocate values to provide particular goods and services. Redistributive policies to transfer values from one group to another. That might be our tax system in a sense. Regulatory policies are policies that might punish somebody for doing something that's illegal or maybe damages the environment. Extractive policies, which takes resources from some actors. And symbolic, which confers honor or disrepute on certain actors. So when we talk about the kind of the stages of public policy, we have to identify the issue first. Determining what condition in the environment requires a policy response. We issue the identification. So our issue is identified. Then we go and try to define the problem. Look at any alternatives. Look at policy selection. And then go into policy implementation. Then at the end you evaluate to see where your policy could be tweaked, where your policy could be refined, those type of things. You could see here this is the stages of the public policy process. It's a circular motion because I think we always can define things and we can always look at things and tweak them or issue them or try to find ways to make them work better, and it's a circular motion, right? There's always things that are going to be that could be improved upon, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So when we look at kind of the views of the analysis of a policy, what direct effects did it have? Did it have a direct effect on a business? Indirect effects. Did we have any unintended consequences on a business that might have happened? Who benefits and who experiences negative effects? And you also can need to really anticipate who could this possibly affect? And you have to look at it all over the country and all over the city or all over the state that you're trying to enact a policy in, and try to anticipate any problems that might come out of it. What are the costs, both economic, social, and on the balance, is the overall situation improved because of the policy? So we talk about prescription, right? Every policy affects somebody's interest. As actors define and then pursue a policy goal, they engage in policy prescription, where policies are advocated and engage in proposing what public policies should be adopted and how they should be implemented. And this is where we're going to get a lot of disagreement on. You can look at the elite approach, the class approach, or the pluralist approach. And these are all ways to look at an issue and maybe try to explain in politics in terms of the interactions among aggregations of individuals who use the political system to pursue their own particular interest. The elite approach, we have a lot of talk about kind of the difference between elitism and pluralism here in the world of politics. If you take the 201 class, you'll look into a little bit greater detail about these types of approaches. But basically what the elites will say is there is a political elite who is dominant here. They choose what policies they are trying to stratify, and then they try to impose those policy positions on the masses, who are all of us. And some of the theorists out of here are Michel Pareto, Mosca, C. Wright Mills. And the elite approach dominates. Elite action dominates, because all us masses are politically apathetic. We don't care. We don't get involved. So you can see here is a good illustration of the elite structure of government. Now we look at class approach. The stratification is a basic fact of structured inequality in the determination of values in a society. Class denotes a large group of individuals who are in similar possessions of control over some fundamental value. Some of these approaches will be different from the elite approach because it assumes that all groups have potential to exercise significant political power, whether it's the ruling class or the working class, the poor, the rich, however you want to define them. And if you look at it here is the structure for this type of society. And what's the pluralist approach? And I think one of the ways to look at pluralism is that you have individuals that are coming together to pursue a common goal or a common interest. For those of you that have seen some of the Marvel movies, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a good example of a pluralist country obviously is Wakanda in the Marvel movies. Wakanda, we remember at the beginning of Black Panther, there was a group of tribes that got together to discuss public policy issues, and as we saw there, they would advocate for certain factors or certain policies that might benefit their group. So I would like to use that as an example. You make assumptions that individual group members are multiple and not overlapping. Many different political resources might influence those who make public policy decisions. And every individual has some type of political resource in which they can attempt to influence policy decisions, whether it's money or the ability to vote or whatever. We also have the group approach, which I talked a little bit about. Okay, so when we talk about kind of the public policy system, remember, it's a circular motion, and it could always, be tweaked at the end to make it most effectively work for us. Okay, so that's what we got with regards to the public policy. Just to know that the levels, the stages, and then we should be good from there. All right, talk to you soon.